Welcome to the Wirecard Saga,
Season 3.
Lies, Spies, and Corporate Crimes.
Mikhail Ryder Gordon, Managing Director of Institutional Ethics and Integrity at Affiliated Monitors. Over this podcast series, we're going to take a deep dive into the Wirecard Saga to see where it may take us literally across the globe.
The Wirecard Saga is a production of the award-winning Compliance Podcast Network.
Thank you, Tom. Welcome back, listeners. We have trial dates. No, I'm not talking about Herr Braun and Company. I'll get to that trial in a moment. I'm talking about Shanmugaratnam and O'Sullivan in Singapore. That's right. The trial dates have been set. Get your calendars out. Shan goes on trial July 31st, and O'Sullivan's trial kicks off on August 11th. Oof, it's enough to make me want to schedule my summer vacay in Singapore. Hot time summer in the city. Now, in addition to announcing the trial dates, the Singapore National Police provided some surprising information in a press release about the greater Wirecard investigation, O'Sullivan and Shan out that way. They highlighted, some interesting things. Here we go. In its statement, the Singaporean police said it would like to, quote, clarify an erroneous perception of Singapore's handling of the Wirecard investigation, saying Singapore law enforcement authorities stand firmly with our global counterparts against transnational crime. Hear, hear. We have always fully extended our cooperation within the ambit of our laws and international obligations when working with our partners on transnational crimes. And then it trenchantly observed that the German government, Munich Public Prosecutor's Office included, has yet to send an extradition request to Singapore. That's right. The Singaporean government appears baffled as to why Germany doesn't want to extradite O'Sullivan, Shan, or any of the others Singapore has sitting languishing in its jails for their part in the Wirecard debacle. In fact, the Singaporean police force, the SPF, added that it had been working with the German authorities on this case since mid-July 2020 and has provided various forms of assistance to advance the German investigations, even as Singaporean authorities continue their own investigations and pursue a number of legal cases in Singapore against the company and against individuals related to the scandal. Yeah, it is baffling. O'Sullivan was identified as far back as the Bundestag IC hearings in 2020 as having played a key role in the myriad of frauds and laundering perpetrated by the company. He was close to Marschalek, involved in a multiplicity of dirty deals through and with Wirecard, and the Munich public prosecutor doesn't want him? Seemingly not. Folks, what are you waiting for? He's key to the TPAs. The SPF noted that Singaporean law doesn't permit the use of statements recorded by the police in Singapore for foreign court proceedings. If Munich wants those statements from their tough love interviews with O'Sullivan, they'll have to follow the MLAT process. Quote, whilst we voluntarily extend our cooperation to our foreign law enforcement counterparts, we need to also respect and abide by the laws in Singapore. All restrictions on the use of shared intelligence and the rationale have been clearly communicated and explained to our German counterparts. Nevertheless, we have also been exploring a range of alternatives to the use of our statements in German court proceedings with our German counterparts. Singapore is trying to help you. Calling the MPP, take the bloody offer. Do we need to run these prosecutions for you? According to the Singapore police press release, say that 3 times fast, the first criminal prosecutions arising from the Singapore Wirecard-related investigation commenced on July 4th, 2020, only 9 days after Wirecard announced it was, filing for insolvency. I love that they wasted no time. But then, it's the country with the world's best airport. Seriously, love that rooftop bar and pool. And not the place to get caught chewing gum in public. Do they still enforce for that? According to their official statement, in mid-July 2020, the Singaporean police said, quote, "We proactively reached out to the German authorities with an offer of cooperation." They said they'd contacted German authorities as the matters under investigation in both jurisdictions, appeared to be related. Yeah. Well, they knew way back when. To date, a total of 7 people have been charged in Singapore for a range of offences, breach of trust, falsifying accounts, money laundering, natch. I don't know. You try to help. And of course, speaking of trials and tribulations, now the Braun-Van Bellenhaus trial was temporarily suspended owing to yet another one of the judges falling ill. So we're now behind another week, as the court told us before the brief recess, not likely to conclude with a verdict before August of 2024. Whew, a year and a half to go. Doesn't it feel like a long time? But honestly, doesn't the implosion back in June 2020 feel like it was just yesterday? What was Herr Braun saying before the recess? Yeah. Back in testimony on February 13th, he was using the unfortunate analogy of having not seen the, quote, iceberg. Ooh, yeah, that argument for the captain of the Titanic didn't end in a positive result, Marcus. First, Braun bickered with presiding judge Marcus Fodish. Did Dear Lam not counsel you to never argue with the judge? What the hell? Okay, so Fodish says, you kind of made a confession of sorts, did you not? And then he reads a quote from one of Brown's earlier interrogations where he said, quote, "In this respect, I have to admit the crime I am accused of." Oof, painful. Now, in the courtroom, Braun bristles, quote, "I never said that sentence like that." Fodish says, that statement of yours kind of reads like an admission of, at least negligence, Braun. It wasn't meant that way. Yeah, He clarifies, "I was trying to tell the interviewers that I'd really missed a big thing, the iceberg, the fraud and laundering. Listeners, let's be honest, this would not be the first time a CEO was clueless about the goings-on at the company that they purportedly lead. Talk about there being plenty of precedent. Admittedly, in this instance, highly unlikely that Braun was so tuned out. We've really only to look at the very early years of Wirecard when Braun was at the helm, and there were only a handful of employees to keep track of. No, Jorg, you do not have Stockholm Syndrome. That diagnosis is reserved for BaFin." Braun did repeat over and over again that he genuinely believes the TPAs were real. Quote, "I'm convinced that the third-party business existed and that you have to determine, you being the court, where the money, went. Quote, "I am convinced that the business existed, but obviously significant parts did not flow into the escrow account." But, and Braun adds a critical quotacil here, quote, "I had no knowledge of counterfeiting or embezzlement. I didn't form a gang with anyone either. Quote, I have never been a gang member or even their leader. I had no personal relationship with any of these people." Well, no, I think nearly every Wirecard employee would testify that you kept yourself to yourself, largely because by all accounts you were an insufferable, arrogant tit. Why do you think Bellenhaus has it out for you? No, we can buy the idea that you didn't want to be a member of any club that would have had you, and you definitely wouldn't meet the US presidential candidate test of being the sort of person people want to have a beer with. But not meeting that ludicrous standard doesn't mean you didn't occasionally wonder about as to where the revenue at Wirecard was coming from. In Braun's words, the implosion of the company was, quote, "a real shock experience," telling the court, quote, "On June 18th, the world ended, and mine did too." Well, yeah, because so much of your wealth was riding on the stock, and bye-bye flying private and maintaining the yacht. Braun admitted he has lost nearly all of his assets, most of which he had invested in Wirecard shares. I'll give him this. He expressed, quote, "deep regret to the shareholders and his former employees in the company. Let's face it, he's light years ahead of Marshalik, O'Sullivan, Van Urfa, and even that Egypt Bellenhaus in terms of expressing genuine remorse. Thus far, his testimony is coming across as factual and fairly serious. The fact that he finally admitted that back in the company's earliest days, it primarily earned its revenue from commission fees for processing credit card payments on the internet for porn and gambling sites, it gives him a little bit of credibility. Now, Braun by no means denies that there were criminals in the company, but according to his own words, he had no idea that what they were up to. He just assumed that both the third-party business and the proceeds from it were fully existent. Quote, I didn't believe for a single second that the business wasn't there. I think the best part was when Braun confessed, rather stridently, that he'd wanted to fire Bellenhaus and Marschalek in 2020. Oh, he who hesitates. The court has scheduled at least 4 more trial days for its questioning of Braun. Maybe Dirlam can come up with some evidence around those Asian TPAs to demonstrate they were real. Oh, wait, I have an idea. Call O'Sullivan as a witness. Oh, yeah, right. So, Braun returned to the stand just earlier today, March 1st. Braun's plan, or Sturman's, not sure whose, didn't go quite as anticipated. So Wednesday the 1st was supposed to be the day Braun was given license by the court to have sort of an unfettered say. Only Sturman seemingly didn't trust Braun to just speak directly. Instead, Braun produced a show and tell, really, exhibits in a formal presentation as if he were back in a conference room at Wirecard headquarters talking to investors. He's really got to let that go. He starts tying himself in knots as he's explaining the so-called ad hoc report of April 22nd, 2020. You know, the one where he's telling investors about the KPMG forensic audit going on out in the Singapore offices. Now, Braun admits the KPMG is not really enjoying full cooperation from Wirecard, and as he's recounting this story, this is where he stumbles. He tells the court that he was just, quote, fried or exhausted from all the legal wranglings with investors, KPMG themselves, the lawyers, and so he opted to leave out mention of KPMG not getting what they needed for their special audit. Judge Frodish couldn't stand it. He interjects, quote, it would have been correct to write that there were obstacles to examination and that you would have submitted documents that you believe would remove those obstacles. This is pretty much direct criticism of Braun and his handling of events back in 2020. Braun responds, quote, the situation had changed significantly before that, alluding to an understanding that, well, short ad hoc public announcements by publicly traded companies to the marketplace about a complex processes, well, that's not really a very good mix. Frodish is not impressed. What will this do to Braun's defense is an interesting question. It really is a judgment call by any corporate executive as to how much information is handed to the market in a short, very ad hoc press release or announcement, particularly when it involves an internal investigation being run under privilege. Braun told of a planned test transfer of 440 million euros from the dubious trust accounts in the Philippines and Singapore that he and Supervisory Board Chair Thomas Eichelman initiated. That this test they initiated was for KPMG in March of 2020. I mean, you have to say, if you know the TPA accounts are BS, then this is not really the test you would suggest to the forensic auditor. During Braun's questioning, Frodish repeatedly made it clear that he could not understand Braun's description of what was happening at the company as Braun was recounting it. Quote from Frodish, I don't understand it. He keeps saying this. I don't understand it. I just do not understand. Well, you're not alone, Your Honor. Braun continued his presentation telling the judges that Wirecard welcomed customers who needed a so-called firewall. Quote, we said very clearly, we regard the third-party partners as an intermediate step, says Braun. The TPAs were viewed as a form of firewall, essentially intercessors who created distance between Wirecard and dealers, that is, a layer to appear to reduce risk. And doesn't this rather go to the heart of Wirecard's model? Moving money for questionable entities and people. Using an agent to payment process crooks, that is not ignorance, it's willful blindness. Braun said in 2020 the company should have replaced these TPA partners and streamlined Wirecard's business model to one which offered services directly just from Wirecard. But then he also went on to say that Wirecard's board knew all about the third-party businesses and that the bulk of the revenue from them was known to be concentrated in just the three companies we've all come to know so well, Alalam, PayEasy, and Senjo. Fotish remained befuddled by Braun's explanations as to why Wirecard would outsource such a lucrative business. Here's Fotish, quote, I don't understand. Why give away a piece of the pie? Braun tries to tell him, look, it was because Wirecard lacked licenses in the various countries it was seeking to conduct payment processing in. But Fotish points out that this excuse doesn't make a lot of sense, as many of the third-party partners themselves didn't have said licenses either. He does make a good point, doesn't he? Fotish said he saw no reason for the companies for which payments are said to have been processed to be looked after by third-party partners instead of, the more well-known Wirecard. Quote, you, Wirecard, were probably the far more attractive partner. Well, yes and no. Remember that arm's-length excuse for willful blindness? Laundering is lucrative, but if you're going to do it at scale, the way Wirecard did, you're going to need some heavy layers of obfuscation. Enter the TPAs. You couldn't run everything through Wirecard Bank, and remember, all those illicit charges on cards needed to be recoded to get past Visa, MasterCard, Wirecard, Amex, and the intermediary banks. Don't forget them. There were a lot of moving parts. You're trying to shift huge volumes of money out into the market on behalf of some pretty big players, many of whom were seeking to evade sanctions, fund mercenary groups, move stolen money from state coffers, and the like. Those TPAs were also gateways to offshore entities, other dirty banks, and opaque accounts in deep pool jurisdictions. I'm looking at you, US. Braun told the court, hey, don't lay the blame for those TPAs at my doorstep, saying they were overseen by digital sales under Marshalik, as if the CEO of a company has only oversight of only select departments. According to Braun, he was completely hands-off when it came to the digital sales department, saying all appointments, contracts, and other agreements, those were Marshalik and his people. So, what, you were co-CEOs? You divvied up the company and just ran the parts you each liked? I'm still missing how the CEO can cherry-pick which departments they pay attention to in a company they're running. Oh, sure, shift the blame to the guy who did a runner. Ursine-loving Marshalik isn't likely to pop down to Munich to defend his honor, so it's a defense strategy, I'll give you that, just maybe one that defies belief. Anywho, speaking of Wirecard dodgy dealings in Asia, did you all clock that 2018 case filed in Hong Kong's court of first instance where Wirecard North America claimed it was the victim of a fraud scheme? Oh, stop snickering, it's unseemly. Wirecard Noam claimed that they had lent Hong Kong-registered company Wisdom Rich Inc. Limited nearly $1.2 million, plus interest, and sending the money to Wisdom's Standard Charter bank account. And then the money disappeared, and Wirecard Noam couldn't recover the loan. Funny thing about Wisdom Rich. The founders, of which there are many, have a string of offshore entities and opaque Hong Kong companies. Two of the named individuals in the Wisdom Rich suit have another BVI company, and one of them holds, oddly, a patent for essentially a shoe insole that functions like a TENS machine, gently zapping the wearer's foot. Seriously? Okay, not a big seller. One of the other companies named in the suit, Kimtac International, is just one of several BVI entities related to Wisdom Rich. Among the others, Jamboree Investments, and a slew of individuals and BVI and Hong Kong entities, all of whom make an appearance in the Panama Papers. Go figure. One even has a link back to an entity in Canada. There's that country again. And some intriguing connections to companies and individuals littered about, including in the Philippines. Isn't is it just my cynicism, or was this loan to Wisdom Rich just another tranche of money moved out of Wirecard under the auspices of a loan with never any intention that the money would be paid back? I think someone in Wirecard headquarters forgot to tell the NOAM folks that this was the corporate business model, shifting cash to evade taxes, sanctions, and bleaching stained cash. Let's spin the globe and catch up on another development that happened with a different court case. Did anyone note that EY got dragged back into the U.S. securities litigation just this past month? EY. Oh, Wirecard is like the mafia. Just when you thought you were out, they pull you back in. What happened? Well, recall there are a number of suits involving Wirecard. That's an understatement, wending their way through the U.S. courts at the moment. One of the larger class action securities litigation suits had to civil sue, unsurprisingly, various investors claiming Wirecard defrauded them. And this one's the one out of the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, and if you've forgotten, you can go back to episodes 31 and 33. Okay, so back in 2022, EY had filed a motion. EY was a named defendant in this suit. EY had filed a motion to have itself dismissed as a named defendant, claiming lack of personal jurisdiction. In other words, claiming EY Germany couldn't be held responsible for fraud perpetrated against U.S. investors in U.S. company Wirecard NOAM in a U.S. court. Now, following EY's motion, on December 8th, 2022, so just a couple of months ago, Judge Brody granted EY's motion to be dismissed from the case. Hold the champers, EY. No sooner had the order been granted, the lead plaintiffs in the suit filed a motion asking the court to reconsider their decision. Specifically, the plaintiffs argued that their request for jurisdictional discovery went unaddressed in the judge's order. The court had found that there was no personal jurisdiction over EY Germany in the U.S. courts, but they hadn't considered the fact that the plaintiffs had earlier filed a request for documentation from EY Germany under the discovery process. Now, for the legal geeks, for a motion already granted to be rescinded, one of the following circumstances has to be present. 1, an intervening change in the controlling laws has to occur. 2, the availability of new evidence that was hitherto not available when the court granted the motion has to somehow surface. Or 3, the rescission has to correct a clear error of law or fact in order to prevent a manifest injustice. Well, the plaintiffs argued under the manifest injustice prong. As the plaintiff's side pointed out to the court, the order freeing EY failed to take into account the plaintiff's request for jurisdictional discovery. That is, for them seeking documents from another jurisdiction, Germany in this case, and that there was evidence EY Germany did have a direct connection to Wirecard North America. They pointed to a memo based on EY Germany's own declaration where EY Germany instructed EY US, quote, to conduct audit work for Wirecard Group reporting purposes on the reporting packages of Wirecard North America, Inc. in the U.S. The plaintiffs claim that Wirecard and EY Germany made false and misleading statements in connection with the over-the-counter stock transactions and that they, the plaintiffs, relied upon those statements as investors. Okay. How do they prove that? Well, they then pointed to how in 2017, EY Germany, not EY US, wrote in the audit letter accompanying Wirecard's 2017 annual report that, quote, we consider, the royal we, the acquisition of Wirecard North America to be a, quote, key audit matter. And so it came to pass that on February 9th, 2023, Judge Brody reconsidered the motion to dismiss EY Germany as a defendant, and Judge Brody vacated the order, granting the motion to the plaintiffs, and EY Germany has been sucked back in to the U.S. securities class action litigation. Oh, Well, you enjoyed the new year thinking you were clear and free, EY. Oh well, hard luck. And the historical acts of Wirecard? Well, they just keep coming back. They and their enablers just can't seem to shake off the past. For instance, remember when at the dissolution of Wirecard in the summer of 2020, there was a start of a fire sale of Wirecard-related entities? Remember Wirecard Solutions? Card Solutions, the UK entity. Remember when it was sold in August of 2020, just a month and a half after the parent company meltdown? Remember, Wirecard Card Solutions had seen all those transactions frozen by the FCA, lots of Brits discovering their Oyster cards weren't working. Now, Card Solutions had connections to the greater European fintech world and offered customized card products, debit cards, prepaid cards, credit cards, cards galore. As one of the largest prepaid issuers at that time, Card Solutions provided services to major European fintech companies like Monzo, TransferWise, Revolut, FairFX, UAccount, Pocket, Soldo. And then the mothership crashed, so Card Solutions was put up for sale. And along came a much smaller company, PayRnet, subsidiary of equally small company, Railsbank, to purchase it. Now, everyone was so focused on the larger Wirecard corporate implosion, not a lot of attention was paid to the fact that PayRnet was a fairly wee little subsidiary of British-based startup Railsbank that wasn't just purchasing the existing card services client business, but also Card Solutions technology, associated assets, and even retaining some of its employees. Weirder yet was that Wirecard acquiring and issuing GmbH, a tentacle of the Wirecard AG group, claimed it would continue to hold some shares in Card Solutions, despite the fact Wirecard AG was bankrupt. Now, around the same time PayRnet was pocketing Card Solutions, WireX, the quote, crypto-friendly company that gave its users cryptocurrency accounts attached to payment cards that let them pay in any local currency without fees. Pay attention to this, it's going to become relevant in a moment. Announced, oh yeah, we're going to move our business from Wirecard to Railsbank for all of our, wait for it, Asia-Pacific card issuing needs. Railsbank at the time crowed that, oh yes, it was already running 50-plus card programs, not just in the EU and Britain, but the US and also in Singapore. So how easy peasy is that transition? So are we really all that shocked to learn that just last month, February 16th to be precise, PayRnet, under remonikered parent company RailsR, formerly known as Railsbank, was accused by the Bank of Lithuania of not just money laundering, but of gross terrorist financing. Lithuanian authorities announced they were investigating PayRnet's Lithuanian entity. Now, PayRnet, which is Rail's European payments arm and holder of Rail's European e-money license, is under investigation by the Lithuanian Central Bank, who has alleged in a formal statement, quote, there is reason to suspect that the institution, PayRnet, is grossly and systematically violating the law on the prevention of money laundering and terrorist financing. Lietuvos Bankas, as the central bank is known, applied for a court order last month to force PayRnet to cease accepting new clients. Now here's the really interesting part. According to Railsbank itself, the dirty accounts at PayRnet had already been shut down, and this whole investigation, it's just looking, quote, backward at suspected money laundering and terrorist financing account activity that happened years ago. Same with PayRnet's crap KYC and AML controls, which also have been found wanting. So here we are, only 2.5 years after PayRnet concluded purchasing Wirecard Card Solutions, and the Lithuanian regulator is telling parent company RailsR, quote, not to establish business relationships with new clients. as well as intermediaries and persons distributing and or redeeming electronic money with PayRNet. And Railsr? Well, they're trying to paint this as an historical problem, as in, we purchased this mess when we picked up Card Solutions. Now, Latuvos Bankos says PayRNet has been, quote, grossly and systematically violating rules to stop illegal payments. PayRNet, thanks to that Wirecard Card Services acquisition, offers finance, financial software, payments tools, and card services to other fintech apps, some of which have millions of customers. Millions of customers. Prepaid card services like Pocket use PayRNet's, well, card services, that is, Wirecard Card Services technology, as do groups like Anna Money, which provides business account services. A Railsr spokesperson said it had already shut down customers and believed it had failed to meet the AML standards. It said the investigation was entirely backward-looking rather than based on current activities. In fact, they claimed PayRNet and Rails, quote, work very closely with all our regulators, including the Bank of Lithuania. And those reviews of our processes and intermediary activities, they're all backward-looking. And as the Bank of Lithuania has only reached an interim review, we've not yet had the chance to give management a response on the historic controls and customers that they, Bank of Lithuania, has observed. We have already off-boarded customers and end users who failed to meet the standards required. Now, we're in the process of appealing to the Bank of Lithuania, and then it declined to comment on just precisely which customers it had removed. Now, ironically, the founders of Railsbank/Railsr and owners of PayRNet, Nigel Verdon and Clive Mitchell, had already put Railsr and its subsidiary up for sale. Whilst they'd only founded Railsbank in 2016 and by 2020 saw PayRNet buying Wirecard Card Services, the company foundered. It laid lots of employees off and the company value fell to $250 million. To put that in context, in 2022, Rails had been trying to get to $1 billion valuation, and now it's struggling to get to a quarter of that. So here's the legacy of card services under investigation for banking terrorist financing. And what does Railsr tell the media? That Nigerian payments company, Flutterwave, they're interested in buying us. Seriously? Are you bloody kidding me? Listeners, if you don't know about Flutterwave, a Nigeria-based high-flying fintech startup, here's a quick brief. Last August 2022, Kenya's High Court ordered that $3.3 million US dollars belonging to Flutterwave be seized in regard to, well, go figure, allegations of money laundering. According to the court documents, that $3 million plus was sitting in 3 bank accounts and 19 Safaricom M-Pesa paybill numbers belonging to Flutterwave, and that this was only part of what an ex parte order had identified as a total of 62 bank accounts belonging to Flutterwave, suspected of holding some $52 million in illicit funds, all linked to card fraud and money laundering. Now, that freeze order came on the heels of Kenya's Asset Recovery Agency ordering a search and inspection of all transactions made by 7 entities related to Flutterwave, suspected to have been used as conduits for money laundering in the guise of providing merchant services. Sound familiar? In fact, some 200 Nigerians had filed a petition claiming a sports betting platform defrauded them of their money and that it was Flutterwave technology processing those fraudulent payments. The CEO of Flutterwave was even publicly accused of bullying employees. I swear, there's got to be a Wirecard internal operations manual that's being circulated to every bloody fintech startup out there. Hey, just follow the instructions in the Wirecard manual. What could go wrong? With the August freezing order, Kenya's authorities said Flutterwave had no approval to conduct cross-border payments in and out of Kenya and accused it, well, of more fraud. Now, back in April of 2022, the Kenyan court had ordered Flutterwave's 29 bank accounts with Guarantee Trust Bank, 17 with Equity Bank, and 6 with EcoBank all be frozen. Kenya's ARA was alleging that aggregate amounts of funds had been laundered or labeled suspicious via Flutterwave or one of its associate companies, totaling over $200 million. Kenya's central bank went so far as to issue an advisory notice to Kenyan banks saying, whatever you do, don't do business with Flutterwave, and if you're already doing business, cease doing it. And now they're going to sell Dirty PayRNet and Rails R to Flutterwave, an even younger and equally dirty company. Other regulators in the EU, US, Africa, wake up. It's time to help your Lithuanian counterparts on sorting through the PayRNet money laundering mess. There's more there. It just needs some bigger firepower. FCA, you busy? AMLA, EBA, ESMA, EOPA, FinCEN? Maybe time to jump in here. God, it's like playing bloody whack-a-mole. Knock back one dirty FI only to see 2 more spring up. And speaking of past entanglements, coming off the rails and coming back to bite in the present, everyone's at Twitter over a story that admittedly dates back some time ago, but resurfaced in that recent New Yorker magazine story on Wirecard. Listeners, you're all savvy and well-versed in Wirecard. So the news that Marshalik meddled with national intelligence and defense agencies in multiple countries and was infiltrating them on behalf of Russia is not really revelatory news. But if you somehow missed it, then the story of Marshalik and Forstrat is, well, I wouldn't call it amusing. Horrifying? Embarrassing? Leaves Germany nearly as humiliated as their Austrian counterparts? I don't know, you can fill in that blank. The Austrians are experiencing a little frisson of schadenfreude, I can tell you that. Does the German Ministry of Defense have the decency to be mortified? Thus far, seemingly not. It will help to put this in context if you think back to Austrian company Repuco and Gattringer, the owner of Repuco. If you've forgotten, go back to, among many other episodes, 17, 30, 36. Here's what surfaced via German media outlet Stern and Capital back in December 2022, so 2 months ago. A small defense contractor to the German Bundeswehr, that's the Germany's military, has been found to be tied to Marshalik and his buddy/tool, Austrian former deputy head of cabinet in the Austrian Ministry of the Interior, Wolfgang Gattringer, and his air quotes consultancy lobbying group Repuco, and for that matter, a few others tied to Marshalik and Wirecard. Okay. A little background on both Forstrat and its controversy with respect to contracts awarded by the Bundeswehr, before we can even bring in the spectre of Marshalik and his Austrian former government officials, all of whom have been identified as having deep contacts in Putinville. Forstrat was founded in May 2016 by Thomas Kolonko, or Kolonko, I don't know how you say it. The year before Forstrat became official, Kolonko self-described himself for an academic publication as holding a degree in information systems or business informatics, description varying depending on his target audience. At any rate, he earned his degree in a comp-sci subject from the University of the German Armed Services in Munich and was working for the planning division of the German Federal Armed Forces, the Bundeswehr. Then Captain Kolonko was responsible for the technical implementation of the integrated planning process of the German Federal Armed Forces. Now, hold this credential because this will become highly relevant to this story in just a moment. Between 2006 and 2009, young Master Kolonko was responsible for the, quote, knowledge management system of the German Federal Armed Forces Center for Transformation, and subsequently for the development and the methodology framework in the German Federal Armed Forces Future Analysis section. Now, during this time, he was project leader of the Risk Assessment and Horizon Scanning, RAS, Research and Technology Project. And with the Department of Future Analysis between 2010 and 2012, he provided data and methodology for a couple of studies, one of which, for instance, looked at how climate-driven migration could impact security and stability in North Africa and the Middle East. You know, that same refugee boogeyman that Marshallek was so wound up about. All those brown people coming up. The same year, he contributed to a report on the increasing scarcity of oil with lots of discussion of Rusland, Russia. Okay, so here's Captain Kalanko, worried about migration out of Africa and the Near East and oil deals with Russia. Oh, and did I mention Daddy was a general in the Bundeswehr? Helpful, as you'll soon see. So here's Captain Kalanko. Forstrat is founded in 2016, but it's not just Kalanko behind it. The company was founded with Kalanko by 3 other companies. Repuco, the Austrian company run by Gatringer, Austrian company Rise, owned by Thomas Grischenig. And if you've forgotten the Rise scandal and nexus to Wirecard, go back to episode 36. And a former Bundeswehr officer who held a role in the Bundeswehr planning office. So convenient. Now, Gatringer and Grischenig, via their respective Repuco and Rise entities, each held a 30% stake in Forstrat. So they held the majority ownership. Marshallek was also involved. Forstrat shows up in a draft contract between Repuco and Wirecard that was sent to Marshallek by Gatringer in April 2019. Now, remember when Marshallek hired for Wirecard Repuco for $25,000 a month for offering supposed media monitoring for the company? In that contract, Forstrat was listed as a subcontractor. In 2016, before Forstrat was formed, the Bundeswehr conducted a market survey for a software project, Future Analysis Cooperation System, or FACT for short, the successor system for an IT platform for analysis of future threat scenarios. This led to an initial public call for tenders in the summer of 2018. Now, listeners, pay close attention to the dates here. At the end of 2019, the procurement office for the RFP within the Bundeswehr awarded a first contract for FACT to Forstrat. German media outlet Capital claims it reviewed procurement documents and that it suggests that the Bundeswehr never intended to award any other bidder than Forstrat for that FACT project. Here are some of the reasons this procurement process and subsequent award to Forstrat appears to be just a wee bit corrupt. In mid-2018, a former, long before, remember, go back to your dates, public call for tenders is in the summer of 2018. In mid-2018, a former Forstrat employee listed the Bundeswehr as a Forstrat customer in a presentation about Forstrat software tool at a defense industry IT conference. Foresight Strategy Cockpit. Ridiculous name. What are we, 12 and playing war games with our PlayStation? For Christ's sake. Well, see, Forstrat didn't have any official contracts with the Bundeswehr in 2018. Then in August of 2019, several months before awarding the FACT tender to Forstrat, someone at the Bundeswehr got ahead of themselves and publicly presented the, quote, web-based platform FACT, when in fact, pun intended, no FACT contract had yet been awarded. A competitor to Forstrat called foul. They lodged a formal complaint and alleged corruption in the procurement process. In July 2020, the Bundeswehr was forced to halt the awarding of FACT to Forstrat. After an initial internal investigation, the Bundeswehr said, "Oh, all clear," and in January 2022, just last year, reissued the tender. Surprise! Once again, Forstrat won the bid. This time, the same competitor didn't even bother to submit a bid. Instead, they went straight to the German Federal Anti-Cartel Office and said, that RFP, it was written to favor Forstrat. In fact, it was riddled with what they called defects, making it absolutely impossible for a company not on the inside to prepare a realistic bid. 6 months later, the Federal Procurement Office held hearings and invited all involved to provide their assessment. Strangely, both Forstrat and the Bundeswehr used almost word-for-word identical descriptions of their take on the matter. The Public Procurement Office ruled, no conflict of interest. The budget for the FACT project given to Forstrat, just from the period summer 2022 to 2032, according to the Defense Department, nearly 10 million euros. Now, Forstrat software is being used currently by the Bundeswehr, quote, without any objections. However, as Capital investigated, they found that the MOD failed to inform the public promptly about the awarding of this contract to Forstrat, which is required by public procurement law in Germany. An award notice that the ministry submitted at Capital's request only dated from the end of September 2022, but the actual award could not be located in the corresponding EU database, another mandatory public procurement awards database. In fact, it still hasn't shown up. The MOD's response, quote, the process is currently under review. When it was founded in 2016, Forstrat that is, Gatringer and Grushenik each held that 30% stake through their respective companies. But at the beginning of 2020, shortly after the Bundeswehr first awarded the FACT project, they each increased their stake to 50%. Kolonko and the other Bundeswehr officer sold off their stakes as co-partners, although you'll still see Kolonko's name at the helm. And by the end of 2021, Rise and Grushenik were the sole owners of Forstrat, having paid off Gatringer. Well, I don't know if they paid him off so much as he just did a power of attorney and ceded control. Rise is also the developer of Forstrat software. Essentially, Forstrat is just a cover for Rise. Rise, the same company embroiled in the scandal in Austria, whereupon Rise and Grushenik's close ties to Russia have raised so many questions as to why a company known to work with Russia and Russian armaments company Rostec was awarded a tender to handle the IT and InfoSec needs of Austria's new intelligence agency, the DSN. The connections between Marschalek, Wirecard, Rise, Grushenik, Gatringer, and Repuco have prompted the Austrian parliament to hold hearings. So now, here are Gatringer and Grushenik. And recall, Gatringer introduced Marschalek to Grezhnik back in 2014, and they attended meetings in Russia together. And if folks are unclear on the timing, yes, Russia had already invaded Crimea. Behind the company, these same people behind the company that the German Ministry of Defense has just awarded a critical software contract to. Recall, by 2016, at the same time Forstrat was being formed, Marschalek and Grushenik were taking a Learjet to St. Petersburg together as Wirecard and Rise worked on a mutual project. Ironically, that same year saw Gatringer and three of his companies, Repuco, Gratis Proximus, and EMV Tektrum, all on Wirecard's payroll, supposedly providing information on power relationships with Putin and, quoting from the contract here, information on security, crime, and corruption. Funny thing, that was 2016. Well, in the Gratis Proximus contract with Wirecard, Forstrat was named as a subcontractor. Golly, and they'd only just been formed, or were they still just a gleam in the eye? Maybe Gatringer meant that they would assist Wirecard and Marschalek in engaging in crime and corruption? Is that what they meant? There is only one limited balance sheet for Forstrat freely accessible in the German Federal Gazette, dating from the company's founding back in, 2016, that key year. The company has only a handful of employees, yet Forstrat's IT platform is intended to help the Bundeswehr simulate and plan hundreds of threat scenarios 10 to 30 years in advance, and in order to develop strategies to address said threats, such as troop formations, communications, equipment, all for planning purposes. Just the sort of intel Russia would love to get its hands on. German planned troop deployments and strategies. Rather takes on a new importance in light of Russia's war on Ukraine, doesn't it? In a Tagesspiegel interview, Conrad Duffy, who's responsible for the financial crime area at the Citizens Group Finanzwende, said he thinks a Wirecard 2.0 is possible. It is too early to sound the all clear. I'd say Wirecard 1.0 isn't over yet. And that's it for today's episode. I know I've been promising to catch everyone up on the goings-on of Troutman, Nokelman, Alexander Herbst with his new Duralis CSE. So much history as the present to keep talking about. There are more PayRnets and Flutterwave Wirecard offspring out there. All right. As always, my thanks to you, listeners. Those of you I've promised to get some information to, I haven't forgotten. Thank you to the Compliance Podcast Network, the best and only place to hear all things related to compliance. I'm Carl Ryder-Gordon. You've been listening to Lies, Spies, and Corporate Crimes, the Wirecard Saga, and I'll meet you back here next week.
This is Tom Fox. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wirecard Saga. The Wirecard Saga is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. I hope you will join us again for our next episode.